Hi, Dr. Carveth. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Christy. Nice to meet you.
It's such a pleasure. I've been following your YouTube videos for probably 5 months now,
Great.
and you have such a great collection of just expert videos and covering different psychoanalysts. I'm a PhD student at UT Austin in counseling psychology, and I've emailed you a couple of times and been pretty proactive about reaching out and picking your brain about certain things. So,
Great.
thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview with me.
Great. I'm glad you reached out.
Just to introduce you, you're an emeritus professor of sociology and political thought at York University in Toronto.
Hmm.
You're a training and supervising psychoanalyst at the Canadian Institute of Psychoanalysis and the author of two books. The first one published in 2013, The Still Small Voice, Psychoanalytic Reflections on Guilt and Conscience. And the second, a 2018 publication, Psychoanalytic Thinking, a Dialectical Critique of Contemporary Theory and Practice. And
Yeah.
you're also the author of 48 published manuscripts that I've seen are all available on your website. How long have you worked in this field, Dr. Carveth?
Well, I always wanted to be a psychoanalyst. My dad was a family doctor, and I ran across Freud's introductory lectures on his bedside table, decided right then at about 14 that I wanted to be a psychoanalyst. I'd always thought of myself as going to medical school, despite fainting 3 times when my dad called me down to his office to clip stitches. I should have got the message right then that maybe medicine was not for me. But I didn't realize that until first year university. I was in a pre-med program, and I suddenly realized I did not want to do rectal examinations or cut up cadavers. So I got out of that into social and philosophical studies, and I thought, well, there goes any hope I have of being an analyst, because back in those days, in the early 1960s, I thought you had to be a physician and then a psychiatrist and then a psychoanalyst. I had no knowledge of lay analysis. But in third year university, I ran across Erich Fromm, sociologist and psychoanalyst, and then I discovered a philosophy professor at U of T who was the first non-medical analyst trained in Toronto. And so suddenly my hopes were renewed. But I realized I had to get a PhD first, so I finished the PhD in sociology. And then the day I got the PhD, I applied for psychoanalytic training. So I've had a dual career as an analyst, a small practice, while teaching full-time at the university for 46 years, and then retired 6 years ago. I always had a practice, but it was a small practice. After retirement from the university, I expanded, and I have a pretty full practice now, and it's ongoing. So that's pretty much the story.
Wow, you're clearly an expert in, anyone from Freud to Fromm to Melanie Klein. And, my experience has been anyone that has mastered the work of so many thinkers. I mean, usually they start young, and it makes a lot of sense to me that, at 14, you knew that this was your path.
I was a Freudian early on, but then during my training, and certainly after my training, I began to encounter the limitations because now I was practicing. And I had all of the Freudian theory, and a great deal of Freud remains central to me. He was brilliant, but he also was wrong in a number of significant ways. And, his theory needed to be revised and filled in by Melanie Klein and by Fairbairn and by so many other thinkers. So I started reading many of the post-Freudians, and I never stopped being a Freudian, but I became a Kleinian Freudian and an Erich Frommian Freudian, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, this topic of grief and loss is pretty pertinent right now because of COVID-19, and I really enjoyed watching your YouTube on COVID-19.
Thank you.
And you helped me with my paper about it, psychoanalyzing the toilet paper hoarding in this.
Right, right. I
So
enjoyed your paper. Is it coming out?
I posted it on Medium.
Okay, very good.
I'll send you a link.
Please.
So, I'm one of those people who loves theory, and I like to know how people are looking at situations and clients in terms of theory. And I know that that's something you appreciate too. I want to frame some of my questions with a quote from your 2013 paper, What is Psychoanalysis? And in
Mhm.
that paper, you write, I view all behavior as an outcome of conflict. In addition to the conflicts among id, ego, superego, and conscience, there is opposition between the forces of eros, which is love, construction, and integration, and thanatos, hate, destruction, and disintegration.
Yeah.
In my view, these are psychological and emotional tendencies, irreducible to biology, matters of the human heart and mind rather than the body or animal and man.
Mhm.
I love that quote, and I thought that it really framed nicely, how you conceptualize mental processes and psychological processes.
Yeah.
So, how do you, Dr. Carveth, understand grief and loss? And given your background, how is your understanding of grief and loss different than maybe someone else in your field or just people in general?
Okay. Well, uh, I mean, I always start with Freud and his classic work on loss and mourning in his great paper of 1917, Mourning and Melancholia, melancholia being the old-fashioned term for what today is called depression. And, he notices the parallel between people who are depressed and people who are in mourning. In both cases, the world goes black. We're both wearing black today, Christy.
Yeah, black turtlenecks,
And
totally.
it maybe suits a good deal of what we're experiencing in this crisis, actually. So the world goes black. Uh, but there's a difference between healthy mourning and depression. Freud sees depression as failed mourning. It's as if the mourning process gets stuck. It stops moving forward. Healthy mourning is a thing whereby you're saying goodbye, you're experiencing grief and loss, but you're gradually coming to grips with the fact that the object is lost. The partner has died. They're not in the world anymore. And it takes about a year to do this reality testing. I mean, mourning for Freud is reality testing. It's the mind doesn't want to face this harsh reality of loss. And it takes a while for the person to absorb the reality. Um, Now, some people can't absorb the reality and they can't let go of the lost object. And oddly, that happens in bad relationships, not good ones. People think, oh, well, I had a good relationship with, say, my mother. It will be hard to lose her. My dad, I never got on so well with. That'll be easier to let. It's the reverse. It's the reverse. Because with good relationships, you can let go of the object because you can replace him or her with good memories.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have a bad relationship with someone, your anger at that person disrupts the mourning process. And instead of letting go, you get something like a hate bond. You hate this person too much to actually let them go. And Freud says instead of letting them go, you introject them into yourself and then you identify with them. And now it looks like you're attacking yourself because yourself is identified with the hated object. So the depressed person stays angry at the object and keeps attacking it, only they are now identified with it. And so we have self-attack. Okay, so that's failed mourning or depression. Um, and that's very insightful as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. Melanie Klein adds a whole other dimension. She says mourning can't be reduced to simple reality testing because the loss of a good object shakes our our whole confidence that there is a good object inside us. This was painfully and slowly built up in childhood, initially with the mothering one, the primary carer. We're taking his or her goodness in through a million interactions when we're screaming and we get picked up and we're hungry and we get the breast or the bottle. And out of this comes trust in the goodness of other people, and we internalize this goodness, and then we can identify with it and feel good ourselves. And so we gradually build up. You can call it faith, faith as trust, not as belief, but faith as trust that there is goodness in the world and I have goodness inside me. And that is shaken when there is a real loss in the real world. And that is shaken right now by this crisis. So it's not just that we're losing people, and we are, the bodies. I mean, you think of New York, they're piling up in those refrigerator trucks. So there is real loss, but all of this loss is shaking our confidence in the goodness of the world, the goodness of people. Our confidence is certainly shaken in the goodness of government, my God.
Mm.
We're surrounded by this incompetence, this neglect on the part of the people who should be protecting us. And this is extremely upsetting. So I think that in this crisis, we're having a hard time with grief and loss and with mourning. So, Kubler-Ross goes through the stages of reacting to loss and to grief and denial. Well, we certainly saw denial for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, as a proud Canadian, we're doing a little better here than, unfortunately, you guys are down there. We're doing a better job. But we have socialized medicine up here, which is a great benefit at a time like this. But the authorities, I mean, here too, the hospitals just don't have the equipment they need, and government is scrambling to get supplies that they should have had on hand long ago. So we have denial, and then we have anger, she says, and then we can move on to bargaining, and then depression, and then acceptance. I don't want to move on so quickly.
Right.
I want to stick with the anger. We have a right to be angry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we should be angry. We shouldn't move away from anger too quickly here, because our anger is fully justified at the system, at the politicians, at people who should have been thinking, should have been protecting the population instead of leaving it to neoliberal capitalism to take care of everything, and the profit motive being sanctified. And we're now seeing the fallacy of that kind of thinking, and we're confronted with the need for universal health care and for planning, and then, of course, at the same time, there is the economic breakdown. And people, here's another loss. People are seeing their savings, radically diminished.
Mm-hmm.
Their retirement hopes undermined. People are losing jobs. People don't have the wherewithal to put bread and butter on the table for their children. So we're faced with not only a healthcare crisis, but a severe economic crisis. And we're right to feel angry about this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the anger can go in many different directions. I think it's important that we think collectively about what to do with this anger. I mean, I'm not advocating random, irrational outbursts of anger. That gets us nowhere. But I think we do need to feel our anger, realize it's justified anger, and channel it in the right directions and do something constructive. Anger is a motivator.
Right. Yeah. And it lets us know where our boundaries are.
Yeah. And we don't want it to turn on ourselves. Unless we do something constructive with it, it will turn around and it will become destructive, and we'll end up beating up ourselves instead of doing something constructive, calling people to account. I've been listening to various YouTube videos from commentators that I respect, and a lot of people on the left are getting pretty angry at Bernie Sanders. I mean, he gives good speeches,
Mm.
but here we are in a crisis. What do we do practically? Here are people in Amazon, courageous people leading walkouts because they're not protecting their workers. Where is Bernie, and where are his supporters in terms of organizing real job actions and strikes and supporting people who are doing this in order to get action from these giant corporations who are not properly protecting their workers? I mean, those are productive uses of anger. If we don't send our anger in such productive ways, it's going to turn on us. We're going to get depressed. We're going to get more and more helpless, feeling helpless. So we need to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, grief is an adaptive process, and I've heard that it shouldn't be treated. Like you were saying, melancholia, you know, eventually turns into depression. And so if that happens, if grief turns into depression, then we treat it.
Unless you want to consider treating grief, allowing it to happen. If a person has got a painful loss and they come to me for therapy,
Mm-hmm.
I'm treating their grief not by getting rid of it, but by helping them have it. Okay, like when I first started, I naively thought that I was going to be treating depression and like helping people get over their depression. In fact, most of the time, what I'm doing is helping people, first of all, be depressed.
Mm.
Because a lot, especially men, but a lot of women too, I mean, they don't want to be depressed. They get manic. They use what Melanie Klein called a manic defense against depression. So instead of being depressed, they start a sexual affair. Instead of getting depressed, they hit the bottle. They launch some crazy project. They need to be depressed. And so, you know, first of all, I help them face the fact that they are depressed. And we explore what it is that they're depressed about. And if loss is a big part of what has now turned into depression, I help them face the loss. I help them grieve.
Mm-hmm.
Because grieving is the way out of the depression. You could say depression is failed grieving. So I'm helping them now grieve. And they're weeping and they're looking at what they've lost. And I'm helping them get in touch with the anger that's in there, and try to find a healthy way to deal with the anger. So I consider that treatment.
Mm. You mentioned that grief kind of thwarts depression. What do you think that the function and purpose of grief is?
I didn't mean to say grief thwarts depression. What I meant to say is that the failure to grieve leads to depression.
Mm.
So one of the ways out of depression is to start to grieve. Okay, in depression, everything just goes black and it stops. And you're in a nihilistic state. And the way out of that is to realize that there has been a loss, and there is a need to grieve the loss. There is a need to experience the pain of the loss. I mean, depressed people, usually seriously depressed people, often just can't cry.
Mm-hmm.
They're way past crying. If you can, in therapy, bring a severely depressed person to the point where they can break down and weep, you're on the way to cure. Okay, so now they're grieving, they're weeping, they're grieving. And we can talk about what it is that they're grieving about, what it is that they've lost. And they can now get into touch with the anger that's a part of that process and feel the anger and not just turn it on themselves and beat themselves down into nothing.
Mm-hmm. You know, I could easily imagine a world where we update more quickly after losses and we're able to get on with things easier, especially, for example, in the case of unhealthy relationships,
Yeah,
um, or after we lose people who are harmful to us. It's
right,
easier to understand why we grieve things that we enjoy. But when you see people grieving things that weren't even pleasurable and they know they're not pleasurable,
right.
um,
Okay,
humans still generally have a tendency to grieve
right.
extended periods of times. What's your take on that?
Okay. See, I think it's a mistake to say that because it was a bad relationship, I should get over it more quickly, because that leaves the unconscious out of account. You have to ask yourself, why did I get into that bad relationship?
Hmm.
Why did I get into that? Why did I stay in so long? In other words, I found something very valuable in connecting with this guy who beat me up.
Hmm.
Okay, that's pretty irrational. Like, what the hell was I looking for? What's at work in me? I mean, look, if that happens to you once, you could call it bad luck. But if it's happened to you twice or three times, there's more than bad luck here. There's a part of you that's seeking the bad relationship. So that's an irrational part of me that I know nothing about. I'm unconscious of the forces in me that lead me to be attracted to bad guys. Um, I need to know what that's about. So why am I grieving the loss of the bad guy? Well, because a sick part of me wants the bad guy.
Or in the case of, COVID-19, a lot of people who complained about, commuting to work and going to work, who are now able to work remotely, are still complaining that now they don't like working remotely, for example. Is it the same thought process there where,
Well, these are people
one
who just
complained
who
about
may
this
may
more?
really hate their work. They may just not like their work, whether they have to go into it or whether they have to do it at home. They may just not like their work. I mean, I consider myself very lucky. I love my work, and I love my work when people come live to my office, and I love it when I work with them online or on the phone. I'm just a very lucky person. I manage to get work that I find creative and fulfilling. Um, but look, not everyone is so lucky. A lot of people have drudgery work that they don't like, and they don't like it whether they do it at the office or the factory, or whether they do it online. And that's really unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, COVID-19 is, well, in the video I made, I talked about some of the unpredictable responses with some of my patients. I mean, paranoid patients, I said some of them are feeling better because everybody's paranoid. People who have hysterical hypochondria, they're feeling better because everybody's hypochondriacal now, wondering whether they've got the fever, the chills, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Obsessive compulsive patients, they're feeling better because now everybody has to become obsessive and compulsive about washing hands. Schizoid patients always wanted to be hermits, and now we're all ordered to be hermits. So those are patients who initially, at least, felt a little better in the face of this crisis. But I have equally as many patients who feel much, much worse because they had early trauma in their lives, and this crisis has reawakened trauma. Like one of my patients, when I told him we had to stop meeting in my office, but we had to go to the phone, he got very angry initially. And then it turned out that what was reawakened in him was the time when he grew up at age 4. He was in a war situation, and his father was ordered to go to a faraway country and had to go, and left my patient and his little brother and their mother in a country where bombs and gas attacks and things were happening. And this was the trauma of his childhood. And so me going to the phone was me, like his father, abandoning him again. And what was really interesting, the other way around, he felt guilt for abandoning me.
Mm.
You know, like he's very attached to me, and I'm old and vulnerable to this virus. I mean, some of my patients have been wanting to do my shopping, and they wanted to shovel my walk. You know, I that's very
They
sweet of
must
them.
like you.
What's that?
They must like you.
Yeah, they like me, and I like them. I don't exploit their transference. I don't let them do the shopping or the shoveling. I can manage these things. But he felt it doubly. He felt I was abandoning him, and then he felt he was abandoning me. So I guess my point is that old trauma is being reawakened by this crisis.
Right. I'm not sure if I interrupted you. You know, you were using the example of, you know, mourning a bad relationship, and that part of the mourning and the grief was not just that we get attached to bad relationships, but understanding
Yes.
why it was something, why we gave ourselves something that now we're saying wasn't all that pleasurable, why we gave ourselves that thing to grieve in the first place.
Yeah, and I'm saying the fact that you are mourning, because you were saying, why do we mourn bad relationships? We should get over it much more quickly than mourning the loss of a good relationship. And I'm saying the fact that we are feeling grief about the loss of what was a bad relationship should be a clue to us that there's something in us that we don't know about
Mm, yeah.
that is causing us to be attached to this bad person. There's a bit of sickness in us that was causing us to be attached. We should learn what that is, because if we don't learn, we're going to repeat it. We're going to find another bad person. Some people just cannot accept having a relationship with a good person. I mean, I've known tons of guys. They'll go to a party, and there'll be 19 really nice, warm women and one, forgive me, bitch. Who does he come home with? It's always the bitch, because he has a need to form a relationship with someone who will be constantly attacking and nagging and exploiting and giving him a hard time. Why? Because that was mom.
Mm,
He has a need to re-find mom or dad. You know, I mean, people are addicted often to replay their early bad their early bad experiences. They need to replay them. Freud called that the repetition compulsion, the unconscious need to repeat something painful. Broadly speaking, that's masochism in a very general sense. The need to suffer. All kinds of people have a need to suffer. Often they're driven by guilt. They think they deserve to suffer. So they
mm-hmm,
get into relationships where they'll suffer.
mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's what I was thinking about there.
Thank you. Uh, so my next question is, why, and you've touched on this a little bit, but I feel like there's more to dig into. So why is loss painful? There are, of course, different types of loss, and it varies in extent, but what makes a loss painful enough to cause grief and sorrow?
Okay, well, I'm reminded of my old friend and mentor who died a few years ago, Eli Sagan, a brilliant scholar. One time we were working together, and he said, Don, do you want to know the secret of aging? He was in his mid 80s at the time. I said, yeah, Eli, he said, it's loss, and it's more loss. He was right. That's what aging is.
Mm,
I mean, you know, one loss after another until the final loss, uh, loss of life itself. Um, I'm a fairly happy person. I go on, but I lost my vision. I lost my um, uh, in surgery. They took out the whole organ. It was cancerous. I'm glad that's gone. Um, I have 3 stents in my heart, but I'm still able to do interviews. I'm still able to think. I'm still able to talk to my patients. So I go on happily, and I do workarounds and I keep going. I'm not depressed. I keep going because I wake up every morning and I thank the Lord that I'm still on this side of the grass.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel grateful for that. But aging is loss. Why is loss painful? Because as the great John Bowlby taught us so brilliantly, we are mammals and we are primates. And like all mammals and primates, we come into the world with instinctual attachment, unlearned attachment needs. And we form attachments. And these are needed attachments. We derive our sense of security from being attached and having these primary figures respond to us and nurture us and protect us. And we therefore instinctually experience anxiety in the face of separation from these figures that we have more or less become imprinted on or attached to. That's who we are. We are social animals. I mean, this is an area where Freud got it wrong. Freud thought that we were these instinctual creatures who were kind of like antisocial or asocial, and that sociality is something that is learned, and it's like an added layer that we acquire from society. You know, Freud thought we are born asocial, but we learn to become social. This was incorrect. This is a part of Freudian theory that has had to be radically revised. No, we're born social. We're born into attachments. We're already attached, well, literally when we're in the womb, we're still attached by the cord, you know, the cord is cut, but still psychologically we're merged with the primary caretaker, and gradually we come to grips with a bit more separation, but we depend on others. I mean, early psychoanalysis had it really wrong. They thought until like sometime in the 1950s or 60s, they thought that immaturity was dependence. And as we grow towards maturity, we become independent. No. Ronald Fairbairn, the Scottish analyst, radically revised that. He said, we don't become independent. We go from immature dependence to mature dependence. Everybody's dependent. Look how we're learning that now in the face of this COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we get attached, and the loss of our attachment figures is incredibly painful. And we have to grieve the loss. And it doesn't do any good to quickly go and find another attachment figure to avoid the grieving. That will disrupt the relationship with the new attachment figure. You have to grieve. And then when you've grieved and worked towards a final overcoming, the mourning and acceptance and so on, then the lights come up again and Technicolor comes back in, and it's no longer just a black and white, and the flowers come up, and then, okay, you're ready for a new attachment because you've purged your soul of the old one through this painful process. But it can't be short-circuited. And we live in a society that wants to short-circuit it. We live in a society that does not want to think that suffering is just a part of life. No, there shouldn't be suffering. Give me a pill. You know, give me a quick fix therapy. Tell me what to do to get rid of this suffering. Mm-hmm. No, human beings have to suffer. And much of the pathology comes from the refusal to suffer.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot, you know, the last stage of the grief and loss model is acceptance. And I think sometimes denial can look a lot like acceptance, but that's the first stage.
I'm going to jump from stage 1 to 5 and pretend that I've worked it through.
Yeah. And I think since sometimes some of those behaviors can look so similar, people think they're in acceptance, but they're really still in denial.
Yes, exactly.
So what's the best way to cope with grief and loss?
Well, I think putting it into words, we're not on Skype, but on my Skype program, you know, you can put a little few words up there under your picture, whatever. And mine has always said, say everything. Okay, that's that. I'm an advocate of psychoanalysis, the talking cure. Put it into words. Research indicates that children can survive remarkable trauma if they have someone to talk to about it while it's happening or shortly after it's happened. The terrible thing about sexual abuse is that the abuser says, if you speak to anyone about this, I'll kill you, right? So you can't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very pathogenic for sure. I mean, speaking to someone who will listen, and that's what a good psychotherapist does. Unfortunately, a lot of psychotherapists, or some psychotherapists, are not such great listeners. They want to be active. They want to intervene. They're too driven to help. And they don't like suffering any more than the patients do.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes good therapy is kind of like suffering together, like facing horrible things, talking about them, weeping about them. I'm not suggesting the therapist should be weeping, although sometimes the therapist feels like it. Yeah, it's giving a good therapy is giving us space for pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you said earlier. You know, if they, instead of grieving, patients will start drinking or throw themselves into a big project,
Right.
and you know, it's okay to have a negative emotion.
Absolutely. It's not only okay, it's absolutely necessary. But
Definitely.
we live in a manic kind of society. It was in the 70s that Christopher Lasch wrote The Culture of Narcissism. I mean, 19th century productive capitalism produced a very different character who was all into saving and investing. But that changed after the Second World War. We switched to a consumer economy, and it was all about buying things and enjoying things and consuming things. And uh, people became narcissistic, and narcissistic people do not want to experience negative emotions like grief. They don't want to experience pain. They certainly don't want to experience guilt. And by the way, that's something we haven't talked about. The guilt that is stimulated by this COVID crisis. I think that's part of what is hitting people. I suggested something about this in that video I did on COVID-19. For some time, over the last 10 years or so, we've become more and more aware of the environmental crisis, anthropogenic climate disruption. And I think that stimulates a whole lot of guilt. We just have been consuming and excavating and fracking and draining the resources of Mother Nature. The world unconsciously is experienced as our mother, and we've been raping her. And I think that not on the conscious level, but on some unconscious level, there's guilt about this. And I think that unacknowledged guilt can easily give rise to paranoid persecutory fantasies.
Mm-hmm.
Mother is going to be angry at us for what we're doing to her, and she's going to come back at us. And so now she sent a swarm of viruses.
Mm-hmm.
Payback time. Okay, you thought you could exploit me forever? You were omnipotent and grandiose and narcissistic and thought you could just go on getting whatever you want forever? Well, try this.
Mm-hmm.
I think our guilt is legitimate to a considerable degree. I think if we knew and could acknowledge our guilt, we would be a little less paranoid. I mean, this in fact is a virus. I'm not suggesting we should interpret it as Mother Nature now being out to get us.
Right.
Well, Mother Nature has always been out to get us. Let's face it,
Yeah.
right? I
Right.
mean, hurricanes, tsunamis, locusts. Okay, but I think these attacks are getting worse
Hmm.
because of what we're doing to the planet.
Yeah, you mentioned paranoia and guilt. I wonder, are those, would you say that's also behind some of the like conspiracy theories?
Oh, definitely, definitely. There's such an upsurge of conspiracy theory, and of course, and here we're back to anger. Part of the main problem we're facing is that the major media are conspiracy theorists. I
Mm,
mean, from CNN to MSNBC to all of these major cable news outlets, they're complete conspiracy theorists. Rachel Maddow, I mean, that whole Russiagate thing, it was just all bullshit because the Democrats couldn't admit that Hillary lost
mm,
because she ran an incompetent campaign. She was extremely disliked for very good reasons. She was seen as corrupt because she is. And that's why they lost. Oh no, it's all Russia's fault. You
right.
know, so I mean, I grew up at a time when you turn on your major television news and you'd get a guy like Edward R. Murrow. You'd get these guys who were real journalists, and they instilled a feeling of trust. And you could kind of like believe the mainstream news up to a certain point. I mean, I'm not saying there was no propaganda back then, but there is such propaganda now from mainstream news outlets. So what are you going to do? If you want the real news, you have to go searching for it, from
Mhm.
certain reliable sources. And you have to become rather a scholar to figure out who can be believed and who can't be believed. And that's just a breeding ground for conspiracy theory.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, I mean, I wish I could pick your brain about conspiracy theories and the psychology behind that in more detail. That sounds really interesting.
Sure. Maybe another video sometime.
Yeah. So there are some articles written about the coronavirus that frame our experience as grief and anticipatory grief. Um, is there anything that you would want to change or add to the way people are making sense of the grief and loss that they're experiencing due to the
Well,
coronavirus?
people people go over the top. So look, you can be over paranoid or you can be under paranoid. The paranoid Jews got out of Germany in time. Freud was under paranoid.
Mm,
He left it very, very late, and he got out by the. His sisters died in Auschwitz. Um, he almost didn't make it. I mean, the Gestapo came and took Anna Freud away for a day and interrogated her, and Freud didn't know whether he was ever going to get his daughter back. But he finally got out. He was under paranoid.
mhm.
My wife always accuses me of being under paranoid, and she's right because she was onto this coronavirus almost as soon as it broke out in China. She immediately knew it was coming,
Interesting.
and she was. People thought she was crazy. I thought she was being a little crazy. She
Mhm.
calmed down. She calmed down when gradually people around her started catching up with her and started validate this is real. And
Mhm.
they got out the cleaning solution and started scrubbing the cleaning and disinfecting, and now she's quite calm about it now because she was right
Mhm.
and I was not right. um, I try to be calm and I'm excessively calm and I can slide into denial, and I had a few weeks of denial there, and then finally I woke up. um, so you can be under paranoid, but
Mhm.
you can be over paranoid. Now, she tends, I think, to be a little bit over paranoid. And at times she falls now, in the face of this deepening crisis, she can get despairing at times. Fortunately, these are moods that pass and the smiles come back and so on. But so you got to find that middle point, and you have to not catastrophize. Okay, I mean, it's pretty hard not to when you see the videos of those bodies piling up in New York. But on the other hand, I heard a little hint of good news today from Andrew Cuomo. They're releasing more and more people, and fewer are coming in. And it's looking like maybe we're getting to the pinnacle, maybe not. But I mean, look, one has to have hope. You have to have a sense of time. You see, when people fall into a primitive mental state or fall into something like depression or severe paranoia, they're in a primitive mental state that Melanie Klein called the paranoid schizoid position. Everything is split, all good, all bad. And you fall into that state, time stops. It's like there's no sense of time as flowing from past through present into future. It's like, this is going to, I'm in hell. This is going to go on forever. This is an eternity of hell, or a hellish eternity. No, that's crazy. Time is real. Time is flowing. And when you move into the more advanced mental position, you recognize that we're in a particularly hard time right now, but tomorrow will come, and then the day after tomorrow will come, and things will get better. We're going to lose some people, but things are going to get better. We will eventually get a vaccine. The airlines will start to fly again. Travel will become possible again. It won't be the same world as it was before. And here we're back into grief and loss. A lot of stuff is not going back to what was normal, but we need to look forward to a new normal in which life will become much happier again.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to resist splitting, all bad. You
Mm-hmm.
have to keep hope alive. People really need hope.
Mm-hmm. And when you say splitting, you mean that's like all or nothing thinking?
All or nothing, black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain people, I mean, all human beings have a hard time with this. All of us, I think the default position of the mind, like the default position on the computer, but in our minds, the default position is splitting. We all fall so easily. That's why films like Star Wars, Luke Skywalker good, Darth Vader bad, the novels of Ian Fleming, the monster and the good guy. I mean, we eat this stuff up because it's really dumb and simple, you know. Shakespeare is hard because Shakespeare makes the worst guy also the best guy.
Mm.
And you know, you have to deal with ambivalence. You have to recognize the two-sidedness of these characters of Shakespeare. So that's healthy. In Canada, people were shocked to discover that the great Jean Vanier, who founded the the ARC communities for disabled people, he's a hero. People thought that the Roman Catholic Church was going to saint him. He's only been dead a couple of years. And then it came out that he was a sexual abuser. And everybody's shocked. And from having sainted him, people are now talking about him as the most loathsome and evil creature.
Mm.
That's interesting. He wrote a book called The Broken Body about how human beings are broken. This is the Judeo-Christian doctrine of the fall of man. We're all imperfect. We're all flawed. We're all sinners. So that when a hero like Jean Vanier is revealed to be an abuser, I'm not shocked. I'm disappointed. It's very sad. He hurt a lot of people. He did a lot of bad things. He also did some amazingly good things. Why do I have to forget about his good things just because I'm now confronted with his bad things? Why can't I take the two-sidedness of him? Okay? We have to resist this kind of black and white thinking. It gets us into so much trouble. And right now we have to resist it. There's a lot of black going on now, but we can't forget the other side, and we can't forget that things are going to get better, and there's going to be, you know, good days in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. You know, resist the splitting, and then you mentioned um, if you're extreme, you want to stay away from catastrophizing and being in the more paranoid position, and then also in the position where you feel like everything's going to be okay and everyone is overreacting. And I think it's a good rule of thumb that if you're veering toward one extreme.
Yeah, there's the people who are way over optimistic.
Yeah.
This will be over in a matter of weeks. We'll be back by Easter. People will go to church at Easter. I mean, crazy. That's denial, and that's splitting. That's a refusal to deal with the reality of the darkness. And then there are the people who see only the darkness. They're equally crazy in opposite ways. Okay. Sanity, I'm not trying to say sanity is in the middle, but I am saying that sanity is seeing both sides now. We should all listen to Judy Collins singing that great song, Both Sides Now. That's about sanity, seeing both sides now.
Definitely. And, bringing things full circle, I mean, a lot of people have stopped reading Freud because he's, one of those thinkers that, like Jordan Peterson has said, he's so integrated in so much of how we think, and he's, the father of psychoanalysis. But people have stopped reading him because now all that we really think about are his mistakes.
Yes. We've swung from Freud worship to Freud bashing.
Same with Darwin, right? And so people don't even read Darwin anymore. Right. And they don't even know that things like survival of the fittest actually weren't Darwin. And we think that survival of the fittest is the stronger get ahead and then the weaker fall behind. But really what Darwin said was, what makes us strong is compassion and collaborating and community.
People have confused social Darwinism with Darwin. Social Darwinism was basically a capitalist exploitation and distortion of Darwinian theory to celebrate a kind of rugged individualistic capitalism. Yeah. That was not Darwin.
And so since we've split, now all we kind of have is word of mouth and false propagation of his beliefs.
Right. Well, people don't read, you see. I mean, I'm constantly encountering this. I mean, even people who have no, I mean, they should have read. They're graduates of universities or they have graduate degrees, but they have views about major thinkers without ever having actually opened the book and studied what the person has to say. I mean, the thought of Melanie Klein is radically distorted, especially in America. I don't know what it is about American culture. It just can't absorb Melanie Klein for some reason. It absorbed Freud to a considerable degree, but it didn't absorb Klein. There's all these distortions of Klein. Actually, if you open any of her books, read any of her essays, these distortions are quickly dispelled because you read her. People need to read.
I started reading Melanie Klein after I found your YouTubes because, I had read relatively, a fair amount of Freud and Jung, and then Melanie Klein, not so much. I'd read essays about her work, but then until I read or started listening to your YouTubes, and you dispelled a lot of that false information, I thought, oh, okay. So,
yeah, people read secondary sources. We rely too much on secondary sources. We want someone to write a nice little overview of Melanie Klein, but they often get it wrong.
Yeah.
You got to go to the original source and read it yourself,
Yeah. I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for you sharing your wisdom.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, this has been, I feel like I got 10 years worth of wisdom from our hour and a half.
Talking to you. Really, well, let's do it again sometime on one of those other topics.
I would love to. I actually have been making a list of some of the other topics. I'm going to send you a list.
Okay. Good luck with this.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
You too.